How could the delays of vaccine supply that we're seeing in the EU impact us here in Australia?
We do know that the government has a couple of contracts with both AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and they are contractual arrangements. We have no reason to believe that those contractual arrangements will not be met.
What is the hold-up in Europe? Do we know? Is it production? Is it logistics of moving the vaccine around the world? What do we know about the cause of the delays?
So I haven't spoken to AstraZeneca or Pfizer specifically, but I have seen reports coming out of the EU about some manufacturing delays. We're very fortunate in Australia that we not only have those strong contractual arrangements with both those companies, but the government has done a lot of work to ensure that there is some onshore manufacturing, particularly the AstraZeneca vaccine. So if there are delays from the AstraZeneca vaccine manufacturing in Europe, we should not see that affect us in Australia.
We have seen some criticism from federal Labor when it comes to the contracts you mentioned earlier, that the government's put all its eggs in too few baskets. Is that a fair critique in your view from the perspective of someone who knows these sorts of contracts and how they work between governments and pharmaceutical companies?
Look, I know that we've been speaking to the government, and I know that the manufacturing companies have been speaking to the government since the start of the pandemic. I think sometimes there are just contractual arrangements and discussions that have to take place. We are fortunate that we managed the pandemic very well and haven't seen the catastrophic cases and impacts that we've seen in Europe and the USA. And I think that has given us some leeway to make sure that we've got the right processes in place, the right contracts in place, and ensure that there is a sufficient supply for the rest of the country. We are also conscious that this is a global response. So we need to make sure that the pharmaceutical industry as well as the governments are contributing to the global supply chain issues as well.
The Australian newspaper today is reporting that senior doctors are criticising the Therapeutic Goods Administration, saying the regulator is failing to deal with shortages of critical drugs. Is there a shortage of critical drugs currently in Australia?
So I am somewhat concerned by reports that suggest that there are shortages related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the pandemic started, we've been working very closely with manufacturers and the government to ensure that the supply chains are robust and can be maintained. And I've spoken to companies again. There is no shortage that is related to the COVID-19 pandemic. We do know that the pandemic has put supply chains into the spotlight and did put them under pressure, and supply of critical medicines has been a top priority for the industry. That's separate from the ongoing potential for shortages for a range of other reasons, and there is a very close stakeholder working group looking at mitigating shortages in the future. I've had several conversations with the AMA this week, and I support their calls for work on ensuring that we are prepared for a future pandemic. This gives us an opportunity to look at what the industry role can be in ensuring that there are critical medicines available when there is a need for a surge capacity or a pivot to manufacturing. It gives us some opportunities to look at what policy settings are needed to incentivise the opportunities as they arise. But there are no shortages related to the current pandemic, and we do need to still continue to look at ensuring our supply chains are robust.
The doctors that are quoted in this piece today in The Australian are arguing that local pharmacies are being forced to essentially hunt around the world to search for their own access to these scarce supplies. They're alleging that it's causing harm to patients. Is that really how it works in reality?
There's a mandatory requirement under legislation for manufacturers of medicines to report to the regulator if they anticipate a shortage or if there is an actual shortage, and to work with the government on finding alternatives or finding alternative supplies. That process is quite robust, and generally speaking, the manufacturer is responsible for identifying alternative sources of supply and alternative ways to treat particular shortages. There is also opportunity in some circumstances to have a discussion with clinical groups, with the doctors who are making the prescriptions, on if there is a shortage of a particular medicine that is going to affect actual patients at the bedside, what are a clinical alternative and what are the opportunities for doctors to find a different way to treat that particular illness. So there's quite a strong regulatory process to be undertaken. I'm not aware of I have seen the reports in the paper today, but I'm not aware of the details of those particular assertions.
Elizabeth, every time we see a lockdown in different parts of the country, are we now continuing to see spikes in people stocking up on medicines like Panadol, for example, or is that something that might have just happened early on in the pandemic and now we've all perhaps calmed down a bit and might be being a bit more sensible when it comes to the panic buying front in pharmacies?
It's a really good question, Ashley, and that's why I am concerned when there are reports that suggest there are shortages of medicines, because it will always prompt some anxiety in the community unnecessarily. And we saw in most recent lockdowns that very quickly supermarkets were under pressure again. And again, we saw reports and social media pictures of shelves being emptied. So I absolutely urge people to be cautious and not to take this at face value. There are no shortages related to COVID-19. The supply chain is robust, and I urge people not to panic buy or stockpile their medicines.